and philosopher to try to figure out some way to have a society based on sort of objective, almost mathematical principles. By the end of the Republic, it's sort of like you get the impression that he thinks that you need to go study mathematics on the top of a mountain for 20 years, and then you come back and you sort of instantiate mathematical forms into the society. And it's interesting because later on, by the end of his life, he seems to progress towards more of like a secret society type of governance, because he has this, I guess I'm going from memory, maybe the Symposium or the other one, but he argues that there's this Council of Night in IGHT, which is a governance board of like spy chiefs.
Yep.
And so they meet at night because the public's too stupid to know what's going on. So, which is just weird because it reminds me of like, I remember reading something about Kissinger talking about the wise men, and like, it's like Plato's talking about like Henry Kissinger's form of like secret governance.
And we devolved to the level of Jeffrey Epstein from
exactly,
Coney Island.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it's all the same thing. It's just Jeffrey Epstein was an idiot, which no one wants to say, but he was, obviously, when you read his writing. And so it's sort of our version of that. Yeah. So I notice that the enthusiasm for liberal democracy, whatever that is, but our system of government that has produced our culture, enthusiasm is waning for that. Like, I don't know many people, I don't know anyone who wants dictatorship, just to be clear, but I literally don't know anybody who thinks the current system is working. So that suggests it probably won't last. So what comes next, and what should come next?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. I mean, I think, again, when you look at Christian history, even in the West or in the Orthodox East, you have a pretty normative tradition of kings and queens, preferably kings, but and that happens through a semi-sacramental service called a coronation service. So, the Orthodox Church always coronated emperors, czars, kings. Some of the most famous, kings in the history of the Orthodox Church, fought massive battles. They went to war. So I think one thing that ties into this idea of a de-Christianizing of the state, which is part and parcel with that sort of tendency in the Calvinist, libertarian type of tradition, the classical liberal.
And by the way, this is the very Protestantized ethos that infected the Roman Catholic Church after Vatican II, which I will be debating Trent Horn on. So Trent Horn and I have agreed to do 2 debates in December. That will be also through Modern Day Debate. I think James is still trying to figure out whether he wants to do that in Austin, I think is where he's looking at. So that will be in December. We'll have 2 debates with Trent Horn in person. So that should be a big draw. And the topics are, I think we're going to do papacy in the early church. And then we're going to do, did Vatican II depart from Catholic dogma on church and state relations? I think is how we framed it. So that will be a big debate coming up.
Ethos is, there's a famous Russian statesman, Papanatiev, who wrote a book, Reflections of a Russian Statesman, around 1890s. And he said, when you de-Christianize the state, you don't get liberty. You get another cult that runs the state.
Exactly.
And he noticed that before
I have too.
before the Bolsheviks, right? So
really?
Yeah, he had looked at the French Revolution and prior examples, and he said, you just get another cult that steps in and runs things.
So you're always going to be governed by religious fanatics.
Yes.
So the question is, which religion?
Want some good ones, or at least some nicer ones? Or yeah.
I've noticed that just from knowing people who run countries, like they're all.
And by the way, Reflections of a Russian Statesman was written in 1898, and that's very relevant to especially all the stuff that we talked about at the beginning of today's show in regard to the Rothschilds and their funding of we know for sure, funding of the Russo-Japanese War to overthrow the Tsars in 1904-05. And we found that at the archives. And then the little more obscure disputed topic of to what degree did they, through the syndicate, not explicitly the Rothschilds, but through the syndicate, through the Schiff and others, fund either Lenin or Trotsky. So if you go back to the beginning of the stream, that's actually what we talked about today.
Deeply religious people, most won't admit it.
Yeah.
Like Macron is not religious, so he's very religious. It's just not your religion.
Some other Luciferian.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what. So I think the Reformation, whether it intended to or not, ultimately kind of severed the relationship.
So we got a super chat about Tucker says, Neil says for $5, this is not Neil from Dirt Poor Robins, some other Neil, says, I saw Tucker was interviewed recently by a Calvinist. Tucker said that he was he was against institutional church. He had problems with monarchy. He believes there should be a separation of church and state. He said Jesus was anti-monarchy, and he was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Well, that's in his humiliated state. So that's actually prior to the resurrection. So things change after the resurrection and the ascension. And that's why the church eventually, even in the period when the church is persecuted, many church fathers still affirm things like the death penalty, right? Which again, relates directly to the role of the state, because you can't have the death penalty on your own. There has to be some legitimate state that can exercise the death penalty. So when you read the church fathers, even post-apostolic fathers who promote and defend the death penalty, Clement does, for example, that shows you that they did not have this pacifist, sort of anti-Christian idea of the state. They were dealing with a pagan state persecuting the church. But after the Edict of Toleration, and after Theodosius, who's the first one to begin to actually have Christian laws in the empire, and then into the Code of St. Justinian, we get the transition to a Christian state. And that's predicted throughout the prophets. That's why so many prophets said that when the Messiah comes, you'll have Gentile kings and queens converting and becoming members of the church. That's exactly what happened in the centuries following. That's why Daniel, for example, Daniel 2 predicts that the empire under which the Messiah was born would eventually be Christianized and become a Christian imperium. So Tucker, again, has a Protestant ethos. He comes out of a Protestant background. So I'm not surprised that he's still defending those issues because, again, when we talked, those are essentially the issues that he said he still struggles with. Now, but to be clear, Protestantism is actually historically also monarchical, except for Calvin. So whether it was the English reformers, hello, Henry VIII is a king. He's the head of that church. Well, I don't agree with him being the head of the church, but that's still monarchy. So early Protestants were monarchists. Who helped Luther come to power? German princes. That's still monarchy. Luther only could have succeeded with the support of the German princes. I'm sure there were other Protestant kings as well. Calvin, however, was not a fan of that. Calvin thought that the state needed to kind of model the church. And so the Presbyterial version of church government is more like a republic. And so the governance model that the society needs is also something more like a republic. And I've read Calvin. I have an entire shelf of John Calvin. I was a devoted Calvinist for many years. Calvin's position is actually a theocracy that's a republic. And Calvin was very influential on the Puritans. So when you see the Puritans set up this sort of Republican city on a hill theocracy, that's just Calvin. So you don't really get a disagreement with monarchy until you have the Cavaliers and the Royalists in England. I remember reading about this years and years ago, and there was even debates at the Westminster Confession Assembly, as I've told you guys before, like they were debating whether or not the Westminster Confession would support monarchy or republic. And it turns out that the partisans of republicanism ended up winning out. And so the Westminster Confession ends up not being a monarchist text, but ends up being a republic text. I'm not an expert in English history. Again, I'm just trying to remember. This is stuff I read like 15 years ago. So there was the Royalists. And this is funny because this is like Protestants were killing each other over baptism and what the form of government is. Is it I think it's Cavaliers, isn't it? There's like two brands of cigarettes fighting. Yeah, so the Cavaliers or Royalists believed in absolute monarchy. And they fought against the parliamentarians who were called the Roundheads. So this is in the English Reformation, you get this battle where the Protestants are killing each other, not just over church governance, right? Because Anglicans favored, bishops, and Calvinists favored a presbytery. But they also reflected that into the state, where they're debating over and fighting over whether there should be a king or whether there should be like a republic or a quote parliament. So this is what Protestants are like killing each other over, even as today they pretend that they're all ecumenists on the same page, right? This ridiculous idea that Redeemed Zoomer has that, Protestantism is the true church. Well, you mean the classical Protestants who were killing each other over forms of church government and the state? That is the true church.
That the church had already sort of normalized between church and state, that symphonia that we talked about. And then and it's a confluence of interests. It's not just ideologues like Martin Luther or whatever. In fact, many of the reformers had very powerful, like for example, Luther's Reformation wouldn't have succeeded without the German princes being behind it.
Yeah, exactly. I don't even remember if I brought this up or not.
Of course, they were resentful because they didn't want to spend the money.
They didn't want to be under the Pope. They were tired of the papacy. Of course,
and Germany was emerging as the great power in Europe. Exactly. And like, why would you want to be ruled by Italy?
Exactly. So there was a lot of resentment, papal stuff going on. Same with Henry VIII. He didn't want to, be under the Pope's rules about his ladies. So those combinations of interests. By the way, there's also Jewish influence on the Reformation as well. In fact, there were, according to Carol Quigley, even Protestant and Jewish banking interests funded the French Revolution massively. And he's got a great chapter on the rise of the Paribas system in France, which is the Rothschild banking system. And then I just read in the Rothschild's biography the fact that they had a long-term vendetta with the czarist attitudes towards Russians, towards Russian Jews, and Lord Rothschild wired 1 million rubles to V.I. Lenin. I knew about other, like the Warburgs.
And by the way, this I did misread, but it actually turns out it's even worse than this, because it was the Jacob Schiff as the front for that cartel, that banking cartel, which was actually a Rothschild cartel, that was funding even more money to the Japanese to destroy the Tsar in 1904 and 1905, and also later through Schiff to Trotsky. So technically, yes, I did misread this point, but we already covered that earlier in the stream.
Schiffs, they'd funded Lenin and Trotsky, but I did not know that, according to Morton, they'd actually wired Lenin $1 million, so to speak, and he was supposed to pay it back, but he never did.
Well, I think the Bolshevik Revolution was ideological, but I think it was also ethnic conflict to some extent.
I mean,
obviously,
the Lord Rothschild said that. He said, we will make the Russian Christians pay for what they did for many centuries, in his mind.
Yeah. Well, and they did. They made them pay. No one's paid more dearly.
So since I brought this up in the discussion, here is the tweet where I highlighted from the Rothschilds' personal archives. And they have a historian that they posted his assessment of this time period. This is the loans to the Japanese government to overthrow the Tsar. This is the admission that it was a combine, a syndicate. You see that right there? And this is right prior to the to the Bolshevik Revolution. And then the Rothschild historian says the Tsarist government had odious treatment of what the Rothschilds called their co-religionists, meaning the Jews, and thus the principal driver of the wedge between the Rothschilds and the Tsarist regime was due to this. Indeed, during the Russo-Japanese War, and this is only a few years before the Bolshevik Revolution, it says the Tsar. It says the Russo-Japanese War ended in a humiliating defeat for Russia. Many Jewish financiers, most notably Jacob Schiff of Kuhn and Loeb, not only obtained from lending to Russia, but actively sought to support Russia's Japanese enemies. And then you'll note that right here, it says the bond issuance in 1905 to the Japanese government was 50 million pounds. So no, it wasn't just 1 million to the Kerensky transition government, which I got wrong. I thought it was to Lenin. No, it was 50 million to overthrow the Tsar. So it's actually way worse than I said it. So, and I'm actually glad that people noticed and called me out on that mistake, because it got me to dive deeper and find out, oh, it's actually 10 times worse. And here's one of the Japanese loans from the Rothschild Bank through Schiff, Kuhn, and Loeb. So in other words, Schiff, Kuhn, and Loeb, as we saw at the beginning, is a Rothschild front, because they all intermarried and worked together. So let's get back to this.